Section 23 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 16. Henry's Last French War. Close and Results of the Reign. 1541. Part 1. Seldom has royal ambition exposed Europe to such deadly peril and suffering as when, in the latter part of Francis I's reign, he joined with the Turks. Even at the moment when he gave up his sword at Pavia, he ordered a servant instantly to take his ring to the Sultan as an appeal for help. And in the times which followed his liberation from captivity, he constantly used the Turkish alliance for the purposes of his ambition, inducing Sultan Soliman to attack Austria and Hungary and to send his corsairs to all the seaboard of the empire, while he himself, with a child's pertinacity, tried once more for Milan. Charles V, on the contrary, though his difficulties both with France and from the Protestant states of Germany were immense, still carried on a determined war against the Porte. He had always intended to make his conquest of Tunis in 1535 the stepping stone to Algiers, which was a more important focus of piracy and nearer his Spanish dominions. To carry out this plan, he sent thither a magnificent fleet and army in October 1541, in spite of all warning that it was too late in the year for such an expedition. The result was that a storm came on before the troops could land their material, and half the ships and men were miserably lost. Francis, overjoyed at his rival's defeat, forthwith arranged attacks upon him from Constantinople and Venice on the one side, and from Denmark, Sweden, and the German Protestant League on the other. The scheme was detestable on many grounds, for it gave a fresh spur to Soliman, who had in the previous July overthrown the combined forces of Austria and Hungary and occupied the latter country. Besides which, Francis was fully purposed to atone for his alliance with Mohammedans and Protestants abroad by the most horrid of religious persecutions at home. His military plan was that in the summer of 1543 the Turkish fleets should ravage all Charles's Italian seaboard, while he himself should invade the Emperor's dominions by the open gates of Gelderland and Cleves. But by this time Henry, vexed indeed at some French backslidings in money matters, and at their support of his enemies in Scotland, but also acting at last upon reasons of sound European policy, had agreed with the Emperor that Francis must be compelled to break his present alliance with the Turks, and to repay to Charles and the Diet the money spent by them on the earlier Turkish wars which he had occasioned. The first fruits of this combination were the rejection already related of the Greenwich Treaty by the French party in Scotland, and the final breaking down of the scheme of union. The war began at once, and Charles, with Gardiner attending him as English commissioner, stormed the city of Durham, massacred its inhabitants, and forced the Duke of Cleves to beg for mercy. About 10,000 Englishmen joined their great ally at the siege of Landrecies, which had been taken and fortified as a place of arms by the French earlier in the year. The politic Charles expressed the utmost admiration for his confederates, declaring that he would live and die with them, and they should be his guards. While the siege went on, the French fleet in the Mediterranean was actually cooperating with the Algerine pirate Barbarossa in an attack on Nice, the last possession which Francis had left to the Duke of Savoy. This alliance, however, was ultimately fatal to Francis's plans, for it excited such horror in Germany that Charles was able at the Diet of Speyer to proclaim war anew in the name of the whole empire against the two enemies of Christendom, whose fleets, he said, were at that moment riding side by side in a Provençal harbour. The Diet voted 24,000 men and a universal poll tax. Henry, on his part, persisted in the war in order to weaken French influence on Scotland. He had now reinforced his army up to 30,000 men, and had also 25,000 Germans under his command. With these he agreed to march on Paris from the north, while the Emperor reached it by the valley of the Marne. Fortunately for France, this scheme was not carried out. Henry, whose many wars had taught him little generalship, stopped to besiege Boulogne, which held out until September 14th, and thus by its steadiness made Henry miss the rendezvous. Finding that he could not make head alone against the French, Charles fell back on Soissons, and breaking his engagement not to make a separate peace, signed the Treaty of Crepy, by which Francis agreed to abandon the Turks, to help in the recovery of Hungary from them, and to join Charles in his suspended struggle with Protestantism. The Emperor wanted, in fact, one thing above all others, the defeat and dispersion of the Smalcaldic League, which had become much stronger and more dangerous by the accession of Denmark. Indeed, he was not wrong in supposing that events were now deciding the future of religion in Europe. Up to this time there had been hope that the Protestants might rejoin Rome, and in 1541 the most evangelical members of the Papal Church had held a conference at Ratisbon to bring this about. But it had failed, and its Italian members had either decided to become Protestants or contented themselves with adhering to Catholicism as it was. As this kind of conciliation had become impossible, Pope Paul III resolved to reform the Church of Rome on her own principles, and with Jesuitism and the Inquisition for her mainstays. For this purpose he gave notice that the first session of the long-expected council would be held on March 15th, 1545, at Trent in the Tyrol. To this the Protestants were not to be admitted, even if they still desired it. Indeed, one of the first resolutions of the council was for the sterner war against them, which led to their defeat at Mühlberg in 1547. Francis, on his side, was equally determined to put down heresy in his own dominions. Indeed, as soon as the Peace of Crepy made Protestant allies needless, he seized the opportunity to murder 3,000 inoffensive Vaudois. But he was quite equally anxious to revenge himself for the fright which England had given him by the invasion of France. Therefore, collecting in Normandy a fleet of 235 vessels of all sizes, he directed part of them to convey a force to Scotland, and the rest to make a descent at the nearest point of England, while his land army blockaded the castle of Boulogne. As in the case of the Armada long afterwards, an untoward accident marked the starting, for the king's cooks set fire by carelessness to the largest vessel of the fleet, on board which he was giving an entertainment. On the 18th of July, 1545, the ships were off the Isle of Wight. Our fleet of only 60 ships, being not strong enough to defend the Solent, ran for the shelter of the batteries, and a calm ensuing, was in great danger from the enemy's galleys, which could fire at the ships without suffering in return, as their oars enabled them to move about quickly and thus baffle the English aim. Presently a breeze sprang up, and we advanced again, but one large vessel, the Mary Rose, was either sunk, as French accounts will have it, by their fire, or, according to our own, lost, as the Eurydice was in our own memory, by heeling over too far, so that the sea came through her lower deck ports. Annebaut, the French admiral, then proposed to run up and bombard Portsmouth, but the pilots declared it impossible either to carry the fleet through the obstacles, or, if this was done, to anchor in such a tideway. He then landed several bodies of men on the Isle of Wight, with the intention of holding and fortifying several points in it, but the Act of 1487 had long ago restored its population, and the militia under Sir Edward Bellingham were able to frustrate all attempts. Finding he could make no impression, Annebaut then ran over to France, discharged most of his land forces, and returning to the English coast, made a descent at Seaford, which the Sussex militia dealt with, and seemed on the point of fighting with Lords Lisle and Surrey off Shoreham. But the hot August weather spoiled his provisions and bred disease in his still crowded vessels. His chance was over, and he was obliged to retreat to Havre. Though the French pressed with all vigour the siege of Boulogne, or rather of the old citadel on the heights whose picturesque ramparts still remain, yet Sir Edward Poynings held out for the whole winter of 1545, with typhus ravaging both armies, and in the next June Henry agreed to surrender the place in 8 years for a ransom of 5,000,000 francs. In the treaty of peace Scotland was included, so that French influence still remained supreme there. Next came, as usual, the difficulty of finding the 1,500,000 which the war had cost. A benevolence had been raised for it in 1545. It was then that Alderman Rock, on refusing his quota, was ordered off for service as a private soldier on the Scottish border. This had produced about £60,000, and the remains of a subsidy were still available. The balance was now provided by a debasement of the currency, of all modes of taxation the one which creates most distress, by throwing all contracts into disorder, reducing the value of fixed wages and incomes, and making recovery impossible by driving good money out of circulation. Yet Henry, by a succession of tamperings, reduced the quantity of silver in an ounce of coin first to half an ounce, and later to 6 pennyweights nearly, the regular quantity being rather more than 18 pennyweights. The evil therefore was a growing one, nor was it remedied till the first year of Elizabeth, when the coinage was at length restored by the means so graphically described by Mr. Froude. Peace was concluded with France on the 5th of June, 1546. A trifling quarrel had all but plunged us meantime into a war with the Emperor. For an English captain, when ill-treated and robbed by the Inquisition in Spain, had retaliated on the first Spanish vessel which he met at sea. Henry refused to surrender the man, as he had been wronged first. Therefore Charles put an embargo on English vessels in his ports, and we in turn seized 2 Spanish treasure ships in the Channel. Fortunately, wiser counsels at last prevailed, and no war followed. Before the end of the French conflict, Lord Surrey had been deeply vexed at finding himself superseded in the command by Lord Hertford, and the King's death being shortly expected, he seems to have made known without the least caution his views on the situation. In case of God taking his Majesty to himself, the proper guardian for the young Prince Edward would, he declared, be his father, the Duke of Norfolk. Others bore witness that he had said, not indeed to them but to others, that when the king died, he, Surrey, would deal sharply with the low-born privy councillors. Another charge was, considering the ideas of the time, a very serious one indeed. The Duchess, Surrey's mother, was a daughter of the late Duke of Buckingham. Hence, as we have seen, Surrey could claim royal descent, and he had some time before applied to the Heralds' College to be allowed to quarter the royal arms on the first instead of the second division of his shield, which only the family of the reigning king were entitled to do. It must be recollected that Henry had in 1528 ordered a heraldic visitation of the country, which was to be repeated every 30 years, and such an assumption as Surrey's was an offence which had been severely dealt with in the case of Edward Hastings, who was imprisoned for 16 years for not submitting his coat to the judgment of a court military. Moreover, the precise alteration made by Surrey had both precedent and explanation in the case of Edward III, who symbolized his claim to the throne of France by transferring the lilies from the second to the first quarter of his shield. No doubt, therefore, such a change was constructively treasonable, and the notion of degrees in treason, or of any punishment for it short of death, never seems to have found its way into the absolute logic of Henry's mind. Another charge against Lord Surrey was that he delighted to converse with foreigners and conform his behaviour to theirs, an unkindly one surely to bring against the poet who had done so much to infuse Italian grace into the rugged forms of English poetry. His own sister, the widowed Duchess of Richmond, contributed to his ruin by confessing, when questioned by the council, that Surrey had urged her to use her personal attractions to captivate her father-in-law. But Henry's state of health since Richmond's death in 1536 suggests that there must have been some misunderstanding here. On these charges, or some of them, Surrey was tried at the Guildhall, condemned and executed. The Duke, his father, was attainted in Parliament, and saved only by Henry's death a few hours before the time appointed for him to go the way of More and Cromwell. Considering that the evidence in these cases was chiefly hearsay, we may hope that they tended to produce the act which immediately afterwards made it capital to bring anonymous charges of treason without afterwards coming forward to prove them. Of the second persecution under the 6 Articles, the date is unknown. 5 persons perished in it. The next was in 1543, when Filmer, Testwood, and Pearson were burned under Windsor Castle for unseemly jesting on religion, and Mirbeck, the church musician to whom the manner of intoning our services is mainly due, narrowly escaped the same fate, it is said, for making a concordance of the New Testament. Poor innocents, Henry had exclaimed on hearing how the men died, and in the same spirit he now interfered to protect the deposed Bishop Latimer and a physician named Huyck, who appealed to him. In 1546 the 4th and last persecution took place, when Lascelles, a gentleman of the bedchamber, a priest named Belemian, and Adams, a tailor, suffered for the still unpardonable offence of denying transubstantiation. But their fame has been eclipsed by that of Anne Askew, a young and beautiful woman who was accused on the same point. With the consequences full in view, this heroine wrote, as an account of her belief, "The bread is but a remembrance of his death, or a sacrament of thanksgiving for it. It gives a thrill of anger even now to hear that the Lord Chancellor and Solicitor General tortured her again and again to find out who favoured her. She was burned, and the place watched all night to hinder her friends from doing reverence to her ashes and arrest them if they tried." A little earlier than this, an Act of Parliament had placed in Henry's hands the chantries of the kingdom, that is, the innumerable foundations for private masses in cathedrals and other churches, and with them the colleges and hospitals requested him to take the property for his wars and the maintenance of his dignity. At the universities Henry used the power thus given him to compel the surrender of several Cambridge halls, and to found Trinity College out of their collective property. Its larger endowments, however, were due not to him but to Queen Mary. In the same spirit Henry left to the citizens of London the ancient priory of St. Bartholomew to be a hospital for the poor. Within a few days of the death of Catherine Howard, the king married Catherine Parr, the widow of the Lord Latimer, who had been engaged in the Pilgrimage of Grace and pardoned after it. This lady was a most kind stepmother to all his children, and a first-rate nurse to himself. Her Cambridge correspondents called her Regina Doctissima, and their admiration is justified by her book of devotion called The Lamentation of a Sinner. She was inclined to Protestantism, her almoner, being Miles Coverdale, is said to have interceded for Mirbeck, and certainly contributed much to the conviction for perjury of Dr. London, who, after distinguishing himself in the visitation of the monasteries, had undertaken the congenial task of forging evidences in cases of heresy. This made Chancellor Risley and Bishop Gardiner her bitter enemies, and according to Lord Herbert of Cherbury, they succeeded in inducing the king to have articles of heresy drawn out against her, as having received forbidden books from her sister, Lady Herbert. Henry, it appears, had been annoyed by her pressing him strongly to allow the general use of the translated Bible, and therefore gave his consent to the articles. Risley, however, accidentally dropped the paper containing them, and thus it came to Catherine's knowledge. She at first gave herself up for lost, but presently succeeded in persuading her husband that if she had ever spoken to him on theology, it was in order to be herself instructed. It is supposed that the torture of Anne Askew was intended to elicit evidence against the Queen, but if so, it failed signally of its purpose. On Friday, the 28th of January, 1547, Norfolk was to die at 9 in the morning, but when that time struck, Henry had been dead 8 hours, and the Duke was safe. Late on the preceding evening the king had been told that his end was near, on which he characteristically said that as his physicians had condemned him, their work was over, and he wanted no more interference from them. He would send for no one but Cranmer, and put this off so long that when the archbishop arrived he could only press his hand as a sign that he looked for mercy through Christ. He desired to be buried at Windsor in the same tomb with Queen Jane, and like his father ordered that masses should be said there perpetually while the world shall endure. Finally, with unwavering faith, he asked for the intercession of the Blessed Virgin and the saints. During his absence at Boulogne in 1544, Queen Catherine had been his regent, but to her great disappointment she found the power given by Henry's will to a council of regency headed by Cranmer. As Parliament had in 1536 allowed the king to dispose of the crown by will, he placed first Mary and then Elizabeth in succession after Edward, on condition that they married only with the royal consent. Foreseeing in all probability the marriage which so very soon took place between Catherine and Sir Thomas Seymour, the lover from whom he had taken her, he allowed her only a moderate provision. End of Section 23.